The wind came in hard that morning, scraping the ridge like a blade and filling the air with grit. Smoke curled inland from a chimney somewhere down the valley and smelled of old coal and wood gone to memory. Maggie Calder hugged the keys in a mittened fist, the metal cold enough to sting, and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wagon wheel thudded and choked over a hidden rutted stone, then spun uselessly in a patch of muddy clay. Behind her, under a blanket, the small tin trunk that had been Emmett Bridger Calder was a weight she could not set down without the world tilting. She had been 54 when Copper Ridge took her husband and left her with land that seemed to breathe louder in his absence, and that day the ridge seemed intent on claiming everything that could not fight back. Maggie waded through the mud, boots sinking, the air full of small sharp sounds of ice breaking in gutters, and saw, a little way off, the roofline of a house half swallowed by a drift of dead grass and dust. It peered over the brow like an island. Her breath came in white tags. She set the trunk down, fingers numb, and felt the world contract to the smell of wet wood and the taste of iron on her tongue. If she could find shelter, a stove to warm her hands and a porch to sleep on, then maybe she could hold what remained. If the wheel could be fixed, if the lock would accept the key, then perhaps Copper Ridge would not be a place that simply swallowed people whole. She found the front door under a sagging porch. The wood groaned when she pushed, complaining like someone woken in the middle of the night. Inside, the air was a slow bowl of cool and smoke from another life. Dust lay in thin veneers across the table, as if it were a map of small islands. A cast-iron stove sat against the far wall, crusted with black that remembered many fires, its door rusted but whole. Maggie ran her palm along the mantel. There was a thin smear of soot on her glove, a fingerprint left by someone who had once fed the stove patient wood and tea. She could smell dried herbs and a trace of salt from someone's knuckles. The house seemed to hold its breath the way people do before they decide to speak. "Hello," she said, but it was more to displace the silence in her own chest than to summon a neighbor. The only answer was the soft creak of settling boards and the distant caw of a raven. She set the trunk beside the stove and fumbled for matches in a pocket. The first struck and snapped, the second caught, and flame licked the stove's throat like a small animal waking. Heat sank into Maggie's fingers and then crawled outward, and the house answered. It was not much, but it was enough to make her knees stop trembling. When the first warm breath from the stove met the cold air, she felt less like a woman adrift and more like someone who might learn how to anchor again. "Found something?" a voice called from the porch. Maggie looked up to see a man on the walk, coat wet with rain, hat brim heavy with grit. He held a leather satchel stamped with the county post. "You the widow at the Copper Ridge place?" he asked. "I am," she replied. "Maggie Calder. Who are you?" "Elias Briggs, mail writer these parts. I thought the place might be empty for good. You okay in there?" She heard the compassion in him before she saw it. She opened the door wider and let the wind chase its way inside. "I'm as okay as a widow can be with a trunk and a broken wagon wheel," she said. He set the satchel down with a practiced, gentle motion. "Got a parcel for Bridger Calder last month," Elias said. "Name only, but the root keeps him alive on paper." He smiled a small twisting smile. "You want me to take a look at that wheel? I can fetch rope and some spare reins from the post." "Yes," Maggie answered, "if you would. And you might tell Sheriff Amos Tucker I might be staying, at least until the thaw. Amos will come to see the land. He always does." Elias looked toward the stove, then at Maggie. "Where's your stove wood?" "There's a shed by the barn. Door's stuck, but the lock might give to a good pull." She paused, and the house hummed like an animal listening. "There's a box in the attic with letters, Emmett's. I have not read them all." Elias nodded. "Letters are keys sometimes. I will come back when I can. Pastor Jonah Reed is due at the meeting in town.
He could bring blanket or coal. Coal, Maggie repeated, tasting the word as if it were food. Coal would be mercy. They exchanged small talk that was really a trade of supplies and promises. She learned that Rosa Valdez, who kept the livery down by the ford, had bread when she could spare it, that Hank Oates lent tools for a proper fix, that Lila Carver taught the children in the schoolhouse and might need a place to warm on cold afternoons, and that Sheriff Amos Tucker kept an eye from the Ridge Road as much from duty as from an old loyalty to entries in the county ledger. These names stitched across the map of the valley like stitches closing a wound. Elias left notes pinned to the door with rough paper, and the house seemed to accept him as it had accepted the match. She set the trunk by the stove and pulled at the lid until the iron gave. Inside were clothes folded in the calm way,
one envelope of letters tied with twine. One envelope bore Emmett Bridger Calder in a hand that sloped with intention. She unfolded it, and the paper made that soft pop that is almost like a voice. The ink had bled slightly at the corners, like tears left a long time ago. The first letter began with a small domestic detail about mending a fence, and ended with a note about hope for the spring seed. The letters smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. Maggie read until the room tilted with remembered laughter, and suddenly the house felt both more empty and more full than it had minutes before. Backstory: Margaret Elizabeth Calder had been born in a sod house 2 ridges over, a child who learned how to read by the light of a kerosene lamp and learned how to patch a boot by the time she was 12. Her mother taught her which herbs drew fever away and where to find wild onions. Her father showed her how to slit a stubborn hoof and taught her to listen to the sound a wheel makes when it will keep going and when it will not. Those early years were of simple work and quiet economy, of bread eaten with salt and the slow accumulation of tools that became family. She learned to tend a stove, to keep a ledger, to recognize the sound of a storm 3 ridgelines away. The second act of her life was meeting Emmett Bridger, who arrived with hands that smelled of oil and ambitions like a map. They married under a frame of rough pine and built a house with a porch that looked toward the valley. Together they planted a small orchard and kept a cow that had been with them long enough to be a companion. Then loss arrived in the third act, and the world altered. Emmett fell to a fever that took him 2 years back and forth and finally away, leaving Maggie with land that needed someone to name it still, and a house that remembered both their hands. The loss was not immediate pain only. It was years of small reckonings with the stove getting colder because one of them was absent, with the porch slowly falling in places where laughter used to sit, with deeds and ledgers that needed a signature. She had scrawled her own grief into the margins of Emmett's letters, folding them back into the twine and hiding her responses in the drawer under the stove where the heat could press them flat. The letters themselves became a map of the life she had to choose whether to carry onward or leave behind. They told of a man who loved the land in quiet ways, who had written about a plan to fix the barn, to register the property at the county office, to carve a name on the mantle for their first child, though none had come. Reading them, Maggie felt both closer and farther from him. The house became the place where memory and work met, and the choice to stay was a long, slow, day-by-day act of mending. Maggie began to establish a routine. She carried wet wood from the shed and cranked the stove door until it surrendered, feeling the grit under her nails and the faint sting of old rust. She brewed a bitter tea and set the little pot on the stove to sing. She made a list she kept inside her bonnet of tasks in the day and names in the town, and she marked each completed one with a small cross that felt like a stitch. She found letters that told of Emmett's plans for a new fence line, and she read them aloud sometimes to make the sound of a voice fill a room. The stove gave heat, and the heat gave courage, and slowly the house stopped echoing like a hollow thing. The first ally returned. Elias came with a coil of rope and honest hands. "We can get the wheel off and lash a spare axle," he said. He and Maggie spoke in short, practical sentences as they lifted the axle and rolled the wheel over frozen ground.
Their dialogue filled the barn with a cadence both urgent and calm. "Can you lift?" Maggie asked. "I can." "Do you know the place for a nail?" Elias replied. "Left of the beam," she said, "where Emmett used to keep the spare." "Right," he corrected, with a grin that held no mockery. He was a tidy man, Bridger was, even in his chaos. They worked in easy back and forth, the way two people who have not much found a common language. Hank Oates arrived with a hammer and a thick glove. "Hank," Maggie said, "you always carried more things in that pocket than sense." "Same as always," Hank replied, wiping his brow, though the air was sharp. "Thought that wheel might need a man with stubborn hips." Rosa Valdez brought bread wrapped in cloth, and the scent of yeast scented the barn like mercy. Lila Carver came later with a blanket for the child who might come to the house for warmth. Pastor Jonna Reed lent a coal of prayer and a small wicker basket of coal to get the stove going when Maggie found the furnace clogged with soot. Sheriff Amos Tucker came not to lecture, but to ask what the county record said, and to ensure that Maggie had a right to claim the land as hers. Emmett Bridger was a name on a ledger, but his absence pulled a line through the community that people kept trying to mend. The discovery of the chest in the attic became the heart of the next hour. There was a small chest nailed shut with rust, and a name scratched into the underside of its lid. When Maggie pried it open, letters
spilled out like seeds. The first was a map in Emmett's hand, the second a receipt for a carriage to be bought in town, and the third a doctor's note that Emmett had hidden because he did not want Maggie to know how thin his chances were. Maggie read aloud, and her voice shook. The letters painted a picture of the man she had loved as both stubborn and tender. They spoke of regret and of plans not realized. She discovered a small key tucked between pages, a key with a brass bow eaten in places by time and use. "That key must be for the barn chest," Hank suggested when he saw it. "No," Elias said after a moment, peering at the teeth. "This is for a safe in the bank house down by the post. He put something there when the fever took hold." A hush fell over them. Words became the currency of secrets. Lila touched the paper with a reverent finger. "What will you do?" she asked Maggie softly. Maggie folded the letters with a steadier hand than she felt. "I will," she said. "I will see what he left behind. Not treasure, maybe instructions, maybe a last attempt at a plan. I will see it through, for him and for us." The community rallied in small ways. Pastor Jonah organized a repair party that included mending the roof and caulking the eaves. The methodical steps of repair read like a short manual. They cleared old shingles, checked rafters for rot, rose up planks for new laths, and applied tar and layered sheet metal around joints to keep the leak at bay. They caulked and dressed seams, lifted the stovepipe to cut a new throat, and reattached the chimney collar. The procedure took a day and a half and left Maggie with hands that ached kindly, like hands that had done good and honest labor. Tension came in 3 sharp measures. First, the storm returned, a wall of sleet that drove up the valley with a sound like small broken glass. The roof leaked despite their work, and water found the ledger box. Maggie caught the box and felt the wetness soak into the corners. Her voice cracked as she called Elias and Hank, and together they wrestled the box out of the way. The second moment was when Sheriff Amos arrived with a man from the county who claimed there might be a creditor claim on the land. Words tangled like brambles until Pastor Jonah stepped forward and offered to vouch for local payments placed by Emmett and to look through the ledgers at the post. The third was the night the chimney caught in a small flare that threatened the porch. Smoke filled the house, and for one terrified minute, the stove seemed to spit flames and memories. Maggie, with Rosa and Lila at her side, smothered the flare with wet quilts and sand from a feed sack. The house coughed and then settled like a creature that had been reined in. Dialogue during the communal effort swelled into many short exchanges, each one a stitch in a net of neighbors. There were moments of humor, like when Hank swore a hammer had a mind to find faces in wood, and moments of grief where Emmett's name was spoken slow as a benediction. The mail rider, Elias, read from one of the letters aloud while the children sat on the floor. Emmett wrote about a plan, he read. He wanted the barn to be a place for shelter for the winter travelers. He wrote he hoped Copper Ridge would be a place where people could start again. The simplest sentence in the world landed in the room like a seed. A technical description of the chimney repair was laid out in plain steps for anyone who needed to understand the work. They removed the old crumbled mortar, swept out the flue with a long broom, checked the lining for cracks and spalling, replaced bricks where the heat had eaten the joints, applied a new bed of lime and sand mortar mixed to a firm consistency, and set the chimney cap to keep rain from sitting and freezing at the throat. The work required 2 men on the roof and a steady hand to set the bricks straight, and it saved the stove from another dangerous spit of fire. The great trial came on a night when the wind rose with a memory of 100 storms. The sky went black as peat, and the drifts ran like waves to the eaves. The barn sagged, a beam creaked, and a note that sent the children awake in the county schoolhouse. Sheriff Amos rode out to check fences and saw a tree come down across the lane. For a span of hours, the valley was a place of smaller, harder sounds and of decisions that had to be made without time to think. Maggie, in the house with a pot of stew at the stove, heard the crash and knew the barn could fail and take with it the tools and the seed and the very possibility of spring. She opened the door into a world of whipping wind and saw that Hank and Elias were already there, their faces made small by the storm and by the urgency of work. "We have to brace the west beam," Hank shouted, voice nearly drowned. "If it goes, the roof will follow." "Get the ropes," Elias called back. "We will lash the posts to the ridge fence." They worked as the wind tried to take possession of their gloves and their voices. Maggie tied knots she had learned from her father and felt the old rhythm in her hands. They set planks under the beam, heaved with their shoulders, and when dawn grayly came, the barn stood more by stubbornness than by sound engineering. The community found itself in the quiet after the storm, with mud on their boots and a new reason to consider Copper Ridge more than a house on a map. The aftermath was practical. They recorded Gustav Blanchard from the county as witness to the repairs, and Pastor Jonah led a brief blessing. Sheriff Amos filed the proper papers that allowed Maggie to register the small parcel of land as hers. Emmett Bridger's small key to the bank box turned out to open a ledger that included a small sum for a difficult winter, a note about a contested barrel of coal, and Emmett's plan to leave a bit of seed back for anyone who needed it. It was not riches, but it was enough. The stove became more than a metal belly. It was a public hearth for those who needed a blanket and a loaf, and people came to sit and share stories in the warmth. Call to comments. If this scene drew you in, if you felt the chill and then the sigh of a house warming, tell us, in the comments, what you would save first if you had to leave everything behind. Start your answer with, "I would save," to help others read quickly the treasures that matter to you. Your memories and small objects help us see how ordinary things can carry whole lives and guide future episodes. Sharing helps others remember the weight of an old key or the smell of coal and how such things stitch communities together. Now back to the story. With the barn mended and the stove singing, there remained decisions to make that would finally determine whether Copper Ridge would be a place of endings or beginnings. In the months that followed, Maggie worked with the village. Rosa taught her how to knead bread in a larger batch so she could feed more mouths. Lila began bringing local children to read by the stove on blustery afternoons, and the house filled with small footsteps and voices like a second spring. Hank Oates and Elias Briggs set up a small market once a week near the porch, where people traded eggs, flour, or a fix for a wagon in exchange for a patch of seed. Pastor Jonah arranged a registry day where the county clerk would file deeds, and Sheriff Amos ensured no claim threatened the small parcel. The barn became a shelter for wayfarers, and the porch a place where new stories could begin. Maggie began to plant a narrow row of potatoes and to graft a sapling apple that Emmett had once measured for a swing.
The ritual of planting felt like a promise written into the soil. 1 month later, the house smelled different. The stove had become used in a way that made the metal glow like a familiar hand. The mud in the lane had been tamped down into a path by boot and wagon. Elias came with another parcel and a note from the post about a small payment arriving for a missed rent.
Emmett had prepaid. Rosa had left a loaf cooling on the sill, and Lila's scarf hung over the chair back. They had named the porch bench in Emmett's honor, a small brass plaque hammered by Hank that read Bridger Bench. People from the valley began to use the name Copper Ridge with a suggestion of belonging instead of only a map point. 3 months later, the seedlings in a narrow plot beside the barn had pushed green through the turned earth. Lila taught a class of 5 children to read from a battered primer, and they filed into the house to warm. Sheriff Amos sat with his hat removed and fed a stray dog that had taken to sleeping under the porch. A traveling peddler, Emmett Corey, arrived at the market with tins and oil and news from a road that had finally burrowed back open. Maggie had set aside a small ledger of her own, not only for accounts but for the names of people who had offered help and the dates they had come. That ledger was a map of gratitude. The stove smoked less and more often sang, and the sound of it became a signal down the lane that the house was open. 6 months later, Copper Ridge looked different in ways both obvious and quiet. The apple sapling had a rough brace and had been pruned by Hank, who muttered that trees liked a firm hand. A small patch of vegetables fed a handful of families, and the barn now had a neat stack of seed sacks and spare tool heads. The community had decided to hold a small communal harvest festival to mark the changes. People from 20 miles around brought pies, preserves, and a sense of survival. Rosa Valdez had cleared a corner for a stall of fresh bread, while Lila organized children's games that echoed across the yard. Pastor Jonah arrived with a hymn and a short prayer that was brief and without cliché, something of thanks rather than pleading. Sheriff Amos and Elias shared stories and a cup of strong coffee, and even Hank let his customary gruffness slip into laughter when a misthrown pie landed harmlessly on the porch. Maggie stood by the stove that evening and watched the smoke rise thin and steady from the chimney. The house had a way of breathing now, a quiet metabolism fed by visits and repairs and work. The bench, inscribed with Bridger's name, had become a place for people to call meetings and to leave small notes on its top for anyone who needed them. A letter had arrived from the county that made the ownership official, but the paper mattered less than the neighbors who had come to repair beams and bring coal. Emmett's letters had been read aloud at the harvest, turned into a kind of map that told people where to put their hands. Margaret Maggie Calder felt the ache of absence like a season that comes each year. But it was tempered now by the warmth of other people's hands. The house that had been an echo had become a place that gave out warmth and received it back in the shape of bread and laughter. The stove was her symbol and her instrument, something to feed and to feed from. She lit the stove and felt the old heat reach into her chest in a way that was almost like forgiveness. If you liked this story, join us and subscribe to hear more tales of places that heal and people who stay. Your presence keeps these stories alive and helps a community of listeners to remember that small acts of repair are the true architecture of survival. The widow of Copper Ridge had not found a final end, but a rural kind of renewal, a last stand that had become the first step toward a shared tomorrow.